I know yesterday I said we were talking about history. I want to continue to do that because if we don't know our story, then we don't know who we are or where we're going. But also we have to look at the bumps along the way. And I've been rereading a series of essays by a man named Albert Camus, who I've mentioned before, who was a Nobel Prize winner, I think in '58. I don't, it was in the late 50s, and he died not too long after that in a car wreck. But he's an interesting man, and he was French, but he was born in Algiers when it was still a French colony, and there's a big story about that. And he had moved on to France, and he was part of the French resistance in World War II. He was a communist and an atheist, and later in the post-war period, he renounced communism because of what Stalin and others were doing in the name of communism, and he couldn't see the benefit. But anyway, and he admired people who, even though he was atheist, who could live by their faith, and thought that was took a strong will to do that. But this series of essays is called The Rebel, and he talks about rebellion throughout history, and why we rebel, and so forth and so on. And sometimes, like modern days, there's not that much to rebel against, so we have to create it for ourselves. And I think one thing he said, part of rebellion is resentment, because you don't have what others have, and you can't understand that. Paraphrasing another writer, T.S. Eliot, who said something like, most of the problems in the world can be attributed to people who don't feel good about themselves. So there's an emptiness in a lot of people, and they use that resentment to build something inside. But resentment always turns into either unscrupulous ambition or resentment. Resentment is always really resentment against oneself. Humanity is loved in general by those in rebellion in order to avoid having to love anyone or anybody in particular. So the question is, how do you see yourself? Do you see yourself as someone who's part of a greater entity? And generally, when you are part of a civilization that's growing and creating and doing things, that's the way you see yourself. When the fall starts, people begin not to see that, and to not understand, and to look back and think everything they did was wrong. Sure, some things everyone does is wrong at some time or other. But then you start seeing, with the resentment, the crazies come out. And the crazies never see themselves as crazy. They think they are entirely logical, and they see the world as entirely, what they do is reasonable, and they will go against anything to forward their agenda, because they think that they will make the world perfect, and they are not going to be satisfied unless the world is perfect. And then this rebellion, this resentment builds into nihilism, which is basically the worship of death. And they are in constant turmoil, constantly. Nothing is ever good enough, and then they turn on their fellow people. Thus, humanity in general is good, individuals not so much. So you get this self-righteous zeal. they have to destroy in order to rebuild, to make everything great. So you get a Pol Pot, a Mao Zedong, a Stalin, a Hitler, the people in the Inquisition. They're killing you for your own good. And then they get you to admit, or people to admit, that they were wrong, and that's just before they execute them or burn them at the stake or whatever. And we are basically going into one of those periods, or in one of those periods right now, where I've mentioned before, people have too much time on their hands, and they're looking for ways to be perfect. I'm perfect, you're not. So therefore, if you don't do what I want you to do, then you're not human. And I have the right to do away with you or restrict you or confine you, and you do not have the right to speak your mind. Just heard a recording of a school board meeting the other day where a woman who typically, basically by the self-righteous right now, she's a woman of color, she's an immigrant. She would supposedly have a right to speak according to what they say, but she was not speaking in favor of what they wanted. And the president of the school board, who's I think now is being called for to resign, but he was retiring anyway, he gets up and he walks down and he takes the microphone from this woman because she doesn't, in his mind, she's not speaking the right way. So the right way is the only way. And then everybody, and that's where the mob mentality comes in, and you see these people in the streets who are rioting and burning and looting, and they're not prosecuted because basically the DA or the feds or whoever, they say, well, what they're trying to do is get us to a more perfect entity. But anybody that disagrees with that ends up being arrested and so forth. So you have I'm not going to go through. If you take the time, there's all kinds of moments in history where societies have gone stark, staring nuts, and then they go through this period, lots of blood gets spilled and so forth, and then they have to start all over again, or people come to their senses or whatever. But anyway, how do you look at yourself? How do you see yourself? How do you see the society around you? Are you allowed to debate? And this is an important question, because our society was kind of built on that. And right now, we have people that don't see it that way. So, again, I finished this not misdirection, but movement away from what I originally intended to be talking about. How do you see yourself? How do you see your society? What can you do to make things go? And I don't care if those people I disagree with blabber to their heart's content. That's fine. I have no problem with that. My problem is not allowing me to disagree with them. So I don't want to persecute anybody, but I ain't going to be persecuted. So you all have a good day, and talk to you again.